I'm going to be giving a long talk today called A Brief History of Time Travel. In part one, I'm going to try to provide some biographical or historical context for individuals who were connected with Project Pegasus, which was in fact the U.S. time-space exploration program at the time of its emergence in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Then I'm going to describe the 8 forms of time travel that the U.S. defense technical community had developed by 1970. I'll go into I'll describe the form of the technology, explain what form of time travel it constitutes, and describe some of the functions that it was put to in the U.S. defense technical community and intelligence community, and then describe some of my personal experiences being exposed to each of those forms of time travel. That's part 2. Then I'm going to go into an area that is often asked is, you're making really a set of almost unbelievable claims. You're not only asserting that the U.S. government had achieved time travel of different forms by 1970, but was involving American school children in the research and development activities surrounding those time travel technologies. So I'm going to briefly articulate the reasons why they were working with children. There were actual programmatic reasons that they had to work with children and wanted to work with children. Then I'm going to ask you to try to go back and remember what you were doing in the early 1970s. And if you could put yourself in that time and place and imagine the fact that, well, the truth of the situation, which is that in the early 1970s, the U.S. government had discerned a number of the major events and major transformative social phenomena of our time, or what we would consider our time in the 90s and 10s. So I'm going to share with you each future event or condition that I know the U.S. government secretly was aware of in the early 1970s, usually not having learned that as a result of time traveling in Project Pegasus, but most of my knowledge of future events was gained simply socially when I was sharing lunch and dinner or otherwise recreating with my father and other project principals on Project Pegasus. So I was not only one of the 140 American school children who went the farthest in Project Pegasus, but my late father, Raymond F. Bashaga, was a projects engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, who was essentially the point man between Parsons and the CIA on the theory and practice of one of the forms of time travel that we were working with, which was Tesla teleportation. And as a result of spending many hours and then ultimately days and months and entire summers in New Mexico, I spent 4 summers in New Mexico, 3 of them being extra summers or hidden summers that I experienced as a result of time loops that were created by teleporting to New Mexico from New Jersey, spending time there, and then teleporting back to New Jersey on the afternoon of the day that we had originally left several months earlier. So in that context, I was able to, being a bright and observant child, I mean, I had been selected for the program because I had a high IQ and a high psychic ability, but I had a great memory, and that I'll describe some of the testing that revealed that. And I was pretty much absorbing everything that was happening. So I do remember the future events that were discussed in my presence, and I can only share those because my truth campaign is dedicated to telling what I know, not embellishing or making things up. So I'll describe the future events that I'm certain the U.S. government knew about by no later than 1972 on our Alpha timeline. And then in the 5th and final section, before I open the floor up to as many questions as you'd like to ask, I'm going to articulate what I think are the choices that we're going to have to make. There are opportunities and constraints presented, for example, by the 2 leading forms of time travel that Project Pegasus developed and was working with us primarily, and those were teleportation and chronovision. Teleportation is a process whereby radiant energy is used to open up a vortal tunnel in the fabric of time-space that the teleportee jumps through to a distant point in the physical universe. And I'm going to discuss what I think are the opportunities and constraints of teleportation, and then I'm also going to address the opportunities and constraints of chronovision, which is a process whereby you propagate a hologram of a past or future event, and you can either use it as a form of technical remote viewing if you look at the hologram as it's lensing a non-local event into the laboratory, or when you stand in the hologram, a kind of a quantum paradox occurs, and because that non-local event in the past or future is being brought to you, you're being brought, according to the theory of relativity, to that past event, and you're essentially being immersed in that time and place. So more than being just a technical remote viewing technology, chronovision is indeed a form of time travel, and it was one of the two primary forms that Project Pegasus was working with. So I'm going to close out that and then just make some major points about where I think we are and where we need to go in terms of grappling with time travel as a society that is supposed to be governed via the consent of the governed. So part one, we're going to be looking at the people. These are by no means all of the people who worked on the project. There were many Defense Department administrators and physicists and engineers from defense contractors and so forth, many civilians in New Mexico who were aware of the project. In fact, when I went there in 2003, I just had to sort of scratch the surface, and I began bumping into people who knew quite well about the quantum leapers coming into the region during those years. But these are just some of the people of note. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of my dad because all of my family photographs are in a PODS unit in Portland, Oregon, about 500 boxes towards the back. And just imagine when I talk about my father that he looked a lot like me with white hair. I think, in fact, I may have been a clone of my dad. So I'm leading a truth campaign to reveal to the world that time travel has been achieved by the United States government, and the U.S. has already used time travel to reach and begin to colonize the planet Mars, which obviously are events that are fraught with all manner of political, social, diplomatic, environmental, economic, and security implications. The problem is that none of us was told. Well, some of us were told, but the vast majority of people of our planet and even just of our country were kept out of the loop because the technology was considered too disruptive to inform us of. The thrust of my historical brief here is that time travel was achieved by 1970. Some of the technologies had rudiments that even went back to antiquity. But the 8 forms of time travel I'm going to discuss today were, for the most part, fully operational by 1970. They were still working a little bit with chronovision to try to prevent the hologram from going on the blink when a human being would stand inside of it, hence the use of small cooperative children sourced from America's gifted and talented educational programs. But even chronovision had been achieved by 1970. I'm calling my truth campaign Project Pegasus. Our presence on the web is at projectpegasus.net, and on Facebook it's at the group site called Project Pegasus. I borrowed that from the federal project descriptor that the children in the project, including myself, were told was the name of the program. But I've never been able, beyond being that one seminar where we came into the learning lab at my elementary school one Monday morning, and there was a beautiful pastel chalk drawing worthy of Jean-Luc's phenomenal artwork on the board. And it was explained to us that there are Project Manhattans and Project Zeros and Project Red Lights and so forth, and all these arbitrary descriptors of federal research and development programs. The one that we were entering there in fall of 1969 as third graders was called Project Pegasus. I have no other verification besides that one seminar at Mount View Road Elementary School in Cedar Knolls, New Jersey in the fall of 1969 to know that the project was indeed called Project Pegasus. There are several other Project Pegasus that are out there that are searchable. There was a road project in Texas utilizing somewhat of an anachronistic technology, which was automobile transport. There was some kind of sidebar to the Iran-Contra scandal called Project Pegasus, no connection. I mean, certainly there were Republicans involved in both of those activities. But I think the ones that I was working with were somewhat more principled than the individuals who were involved in some kind of domestic assassination program that was a sidebar, or drug running as a sidebar to Iran-Contra. No connection, except perhaps through George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. But let's not go there. Okay, so now the overarching purpose of my truth campaign is to advantage humanity with the life-advantaging benefits of teleportation and chronovision in the 21st century and beyond. And I believe that that's a quest that we, as the developers of this technology, the people of the United States, should lead. And in order to do that, the people of the United States are going to know what was done in their name with their tax dollars and with the minds of some of their brightest physicists and engineers. I was enrolled officially in Project Pegasus. Oh. This is even set up. This is my key picture from kindergarten. Some people say I look a little bit too much like a young George W. Bush there, and I have to plead guilty to that. So, or Ron Howard at 5. But that's my picture at age 5 in 1966. That's my kindergarten portrait from Mount View Road Elementary in Cedar Knolls, New Jersey, a public grammar school where we were trained secretly to be involved in time travel at off-campus locations among different defense contractor locations in New Jersey, New Mexico, and Ohio. The first time that I can remember teleporting, clearly I was age 6, and I'm going to give the facts of that. But in my discussions with my late father before his death in 1990, I believe that I first teleported with him to New Mexico, to Santa Fe, New Mexico, as a 4-year-old, because I was being acclimated to the project technologies. And so this picture would have been taken a year after I first teleported, I think, but it certainly was taken a year before that I can say to a factual certainty that I teleported as a 6-year-old. I was involved in real time on my Alpha timeline in New Jersey in Project Pegasus from the fall of 1969 to the end of the summer of 1972. But when I went back and began researching my project experiences, initially in 1999, really right around the time that I met Alfred, and we became good friends and collaborators, really, I was just writing things down, fragmentary memories were coming back. I began to research my project experiences in 2001 and 2 in earnest, and I ultimately reconstructed the timeline of what happened during those years. In the fall of 1969, I was placed in a learning lab that I later learned that 140 other bright kids around the country were put in similar labs. We were in 14 regiments of 10 children, each of which were identified by a color. Ours was Blue Team, and I was the captain of Blue Team, which meant that I got certain specialized training of what to do on behalf of the other kids if there was a project emergency or some unforeseen event of some kind. I was enrolled in fall of '69. This was right after the lunar landing in July of 1969. There was a great deal of optimism in the defense technical community. My own father had undergone the FBI security clearance to work on the lunar module project, but that had gone from Parsons to Grumman, and it was one of the great disappointments of his career that he was hoping to be able to brag to his grandchildren that he had helped work on the instrumentation for the lunar module, but he couldn't brag to them about the fact that he helped the U.S. government achieve time travel. So I think I'll dedicate today's discussion in Hawaii to my late dad. So in fall of '69, I placed in a learning lab where all manner of strange things occurred, basically. Initially, they began working with us extensively in developing our psychic ability. They were doing things like playing a card game with us, where the teacher would look at a standard playing card. She'd take a card from the deck and look at it and concentrate on it, holding it up to her forehead. And I remember getting the card right, 1 out of 52 chances, every round for like 90 minutes or 2 hours. So I was clearly not a trailing edge boomer, but a cutting edge indigo. Earlier, at age 3 and 4, I was manifesting such special abilities as going down into our cellar there in Mars Plains, New Jersey, at our house in Mars Plains, and listening to what my father was thinking and completing his thoughts. So I remember one time he was at his table saw, and I was listening to his own internal chatter about his marriage, which was a very solid one. My mother was a wonderful wife and mother. My dad was certainly a solid husband and father. But he was saying he had some kind of argument or something with my mom, and he was saying, I was listening to his mind turn, and I said, "Dad, you shouldn't say that." Or no, I said, "You shouldn't think that. Mom doesn't just view you as a meal ticket." So my dad was a very hard-boiled engineer. He had gotten a BS in electrical engineering from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and he had to kind of cope with, this is sort of like the Tom Hanks father figure in the movie. He had to kind of cope with the fact that his young son was manifesting some special abilities. In another incident, when I was about 3, I had been watching my next eldest brothers, Gregory and Christopher, build a building about 3 feet off the floor of our rec room there in Morris Plains. And I was 3, they were what, 6, well, Greg was 4, Chris must have been about 8. No, he would have been 7. They knocked it down and ran outdoors, and I have been watching them wondering why here on Earth, when you build something, you have to start from the ground. Because in previous incarnations, we just suspended things in midair. And I had a flashback to being a little gray, sitting next to another little gray, watching an adult gray show us how to levitate things just using the purity of our intent. I won't even say the strength of our minds, because in fact, we had been taught to levitate by simply manifesting absolute belief that something would stay where we put it. So after my brothers ran outside, I picked up my alphabet blocks. I know I was not yet in kindergarten here, so this must have been 1964, 65. My dad has a history in aerospace that goes back to the ramjet project at Curtiss Wright in 1952. He's worked on the B-70, which was the nuclear-equipped bomber. So he comes out of his carpentry shop there in the cellar and sees his 5th child, his number 3 son, as he used to call me, levitating his toys off the ground. And in fact, some of the objects were circulating around each other, as we've now seen in The Last Mimsy and The Matrix and other feature films that have shown gifted kids doing this. So I was a special kid. I'd like to think of myself as a cutting-edge indigo, and I'm also sort of conscious of that as I wage my truth campaign, because I do believe that there were cadre of souls or what have you that have come into the world in this generation, and I suspect I may have been one of the initial entries. Also, as a result of my relationship with my father, I know to an historical certainty that I was the first American child to teleport via Tesla teleportation. When I had a number of heart-to-heart discussions with my late dad in the late 80s before his death in 1990, I was asking him questions like, well, Dad, I remember going to New Mexico through the Tesla device up at Curtiss Wright at a very young age. Was I, in fact, the first kid to teleport? The first American kid, maybe? And he said, well, the first group of teleportees utilizing this technology that had actually been based at Curtiss Wright, but then they were happy that the Lenni Lenape Indians had lived there for hundreds of years, and they selected Santa Fe, as I mentioned yesterday, because they were very old inhabited regions of the country. He said, no, in fact, son, the first 3 teleportees were Navy enlisted volunteers who died because the Vortal tunnel that we opened up, these were the intentional teleportees. The first was somebody who, when they set up the Tesla device there at Curtiss Wright, he walked through the field of radiant energy that was attuned between the 2 elliptical armatures of the device and found himself tumbling to Africa. So in fact, the first teleportee through the Tesla device that the defense technical community at least had tracked the use of the technology was an accidental teleportee to Africa. But then when they tried to standardize what it was doing and figure out how it was working as a teleportation device, after he returned to the United States from Africa, and his supervisor practically collapsed in the lab because he thought he'd been killed when he jumped through the field of radiant energy. So when they standardized and began intentionally running exercises, the first 3 individuals to jump through were adults, and they perished because the Vortal tunnel in time-space that had been opened up too long, and they ran out of oxygen because we were surviving just in the air that we pushed into the Vortal tunnel with our bodies, and we were only in there for several seconds. In fact, in later exercises where we were taking a Stargate device to the distant future, I was actually trained how to inflate my lungs and take little sips of air off the top of my lungs to persist for the 30 or 60 seconds that it would take to teleport utilizing that device. I was an alto saxophone player already, so I was pretty comfortable with that, of storing up my air and utilizing it economically. But I have kind of been troubled in adulthood with a kind of a respiratory syndrome where I can't can't release the air in my lungs very easily. Or it crops up every once in a while. So we were not wearing any specialized respiratory equipment. We were jumping through, as Jack Pruitt, one of the team leaders, said, an interstitial chasm in the fabric of time-space, unassisted by any kind of specialized respiratory equipment. Okay, so I then said, well, who was next? Did I follow the 3 Navy enlisted personnel with you? And he said, no. In fact, we were doing something kind of unethical. The Defense Department was negotiating with the corrupt right-wing authoritarian governments in Latin America to take orphans, street urchins, off the streets of Rio and Santiago and Maracaibo and Mexico City and other Latin American capitals, bringing them up to the United States, usually to New Mexico, and involving them involuntarily in defense technical experimentation that might cause them to die or be wounded, to be injured. Usually they were not. They usually did not lose their life nor limb. And the kind of moral dispensation that the individuals in the Defense Department told themselves to excuse this kind of involuntary human subject experimentation involving indeed orphans from Latin America was that after they passed a certain threshold of testing, they were discharged from the program and given, in the United States, everything they would have been deprived of in their home countries. Parents, a house to live in, enough food to eat, and adequate clothing and education and health care. So they were ultimately dismissed from the projects and then adopted into American households as former orphans. So in fact, some individuals of Latin American heritage, my age, born roughly between 1957 and 61, who were adopted in the 1960s into households, for example, in New Mexico, are among my time-space compatriots. And I mention that because ultimately, as I lecture, I'm waiting for one of those individuals to step forward. For my own part, I took part in 8 different forms of time travel, several of which were new, dangerous, and experimental activities in applied quantum physics, then being researched and developed by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So I also took part in exercises where I could have lost my life or limb and where other children were grievously wounded, and I'll describe some of those incidents, just to know that a price was paid, a steep human price was paid to give the United States a time travel capability. And I think that's another reason why it's immoral to conceal it and not use it to advantage humanity, because some human beings paid a huge price in bringing about its development. Project Pegasus was carried out under the aegis of DARPA. During our training, of course, in those years, DARPA was not the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, it was the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA. I remember sitting in a briefing where a group of us were sitting at an Army base in Morristown. It might have been the Morristown Army Arsenal, or the Picatinny Arsenal outside of Morristown. And the instructor, who was in an Army uniform, put the word ARPA on the board. And he explained to us that this was the most advanced agency in the U.S. Defense Department, working on the development of military technology to include weaponry and communication systems. It was the historical fulfillment of an effort, they told us at least, begun by General George Washington during the Revolutionary War, when he commissioned some scientists to build a more effective form of gunpowder for him. But by our time, DARPA, we know, is the U.S. Defense Agency or sub-agency of the Department of Defense that has brought us Star Wars weaponry and the internet that in turn the National Security Agency has used to place Facebook and other intelligence gathering software on. So DARPA is the principal research and development agency of the Department of Defense. The principal defense contractor involved in Project Pegasus, there were several. The principal one was the Ralph M. Parsons Company of New York, New York, later known as the Parsons Corporation of Pasadena, California. Here's the founder of Parsons, the eccentric Ralph M. Parsons, who had been a lieutenant to Stephen Bechtel during World War II when Bechtel was building Liberty ships for the U.S. Navy. Bechtel's other lieutenant was John Alexander McCone, who we'll be meeting in a minute, who would go on to a career as the director of Central Intelligence, ultimately with the CIA. Bechtel and his lieutenant Ralph M. Parsons went on to found the 2 largest process engineering companies in the world. And over the years, really since the end of World War II, the company that Stephen Bechtel founded and the company that my father's employer, Ralph M. Parsons, founded, have been vying with each other to be the largest process engineering company in the world. I think Parsons is now about an $8 billion company. I remember sitting in Ralph M. Parsons' office when Parsons was still on Wall Street in New York City, and he was a very eccentric man, a lifelong bachelor with a very a cackling laugh and a very unusual sense of humor, but really a brilliant individual. He started Parsons in his garage, I guess like Apple Computer and Hewlett-Packard were, started in garages, and built it into literally one of the largest companies in the world, and at many times the largest engineering firm in the world. For example, you question whether Parsons was actually the defense contractor most responsible for permitting the United States to achieve time travel. Well, they built an entire city called Yanbui in Saudi Arabia. And I don't just mean a site plan for an engineering project. They built an entire city the size of Pasadena from the desert sands of Saudi Arabia with about $8 billion from the Saudis. Because of these Saudi connections, or Middle Eastern, I should say, after Project Pegasus after Parsons had achieved time travel for the U.S. government under Project Pegasus, and as shown on the Parsons Corporation website in its official biography of Ralph M. Parsons, even up to a couple of years ago when I began mentioning this in my lectures, in 1972, after around the time that I was dismissed from the project just as a pro forma matter, Ralph M. bought the world's largest private yacht from the Iranian arms merchant, the billionaire Adnan Khashoggi, and rechristened the ship Pegasus II, even though Parsons had never owned anything named Pegasus, and the ship bore a Persian name when it was under the ownership of Mr. Khashoggi. So here we had literally a clue to Project Pegasus dangling out in cyberspace, and Parsons put it there. So if you think that the time travel secrets aren't just hovering there right near the surface of Pasadena, California, like they were in Albuquerque and Santa Fe and Los Alamos, New Mexico. In fact, they were until a few years ago. Then they sanitized the official biography of Mr. Parsons to conceal that he named his ship for the project that made him a billionaire, because clearly he was richly rewarded for allowing DARPA or helping DARPA achieve time travel. I'm often asked whether he had any connection to John Northcote Parsons, the so-called Jack Parsons, the founder of the Jet Propulsion Lab, also in Pasadena. He of the untoward friendship with L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology and Aleister Crowley of Satanism and so forth. To my knowledge, there was no connection, either personal nor family. He's just another person named Parsons who was doing work for the government in Pasadena. If I find a connection, operational, organizational, or family, I'll announce it, but I think he was from a different part of the Parsons family. There were certainly no creepy people hovering around the project except one pedophile whose career I put an end to in the summer of 1967. But generally, there wasn't a heavy involvement in Satanism or the occult or these other issues that can get conflated with the name Parsons because of the career of Jack Parsons, not Ralph M. Parsons. I also like to distinguish at this part, early in my lecture here, I'm just going over sort of the biography, the sort of cultural history of the participants, that Project Pegasus was not a time travel project per se. It was an intelligence gathering program of the Central Intelligence Agency. For example, in the early 2010s, when I went in search of my father's background with the intelligence community, I was working through an historian in Texas, who shall remain nameless because he asked for confidentiality, who got me to CIA and the Office of Naval Intelligence. And the word that came back from CIA about my request for them to reveal my dad's personnel file with them is it is not our policy to release information to the family members of living and deceased CIA personnel. So again, just like they wanted me to stop researching and writing and talking about the project, or they couldn't, quote unquote, guarantee my survival, which meant they would kill me, my dad, they were clearly telling me, look, we can't tell you this, but your dad was CIA. I kind of knew that because one time we were walking into the La Placita restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque with some of the project engineers who were also presumably Parsons CIA. And one of the engineers said, La Placita, Andy, that's C-I-T-A. And you know what CIA means? And my father actually shushed them as we were entering the restaurant as a group of project personnel. So the principal agency involved in promulgating this team to achieve time travel was the CIA. And as we'll find later, another reason I'm speaking out is because the CIA has used time travel to capture the American presidency, and we need to relinquish its grip on the US presidency. The nexus between the CIA and the presidency is the quantum access capability that Project Pegasus gave the CIA. So I bring up the CIA early in my lecture here because its involvement wasn't just profound, it was primary. Project Pegasus was to perform remote sensing in time of past and future events to aid the US government in formulating contingency plans for future events. Like, let's say, 9/11. Like, maybe if we're going to have the World Trade Centers fall down, maybe engage in some contingency planning and have Bruce Springsteen write that song, My City in Ruins. Okay, so the contingency planning, I believe, has gotten very elaborate, and 9/11 was really the major Murphy that the executive branch ran into, because they were slipping up all over the place, revealing that they had prior knowledge of the event in the way that that reporter for the BBC was reporting the collapse of Building 7 before it happened, which is either psychic journalism or state journalism informed by quantum access. I'll let you determine which. Okay. Project Pegasus was providing data that was being drafted by the CIA into forward intelligence reports. Now, an intelligence report derived via time travel might say something like, we've just determined that all dinosaurs were highly intelligent. Okay, it might include some esoteric fact about the future, or we're absolutely certain that the entire Soviet leadership are actually crypto-Christians and capitalists. Okay, but it also has included literal statements of future events derived via quantum access. These reports containing information about future events have been circulating among US government officials who possess a need-to-know only level of clearance ever since. So a major idea here is, look, our executive branch is being administered by people who have knowledge of the future. How could I hold that back from the American people? It would be morally wrong to do so. It's morally wrong that this has occurred, and in a society where we're supposed to be governed in a representative democracy under a constitutional republic, how is it that we could have a class of insiders with knowledge of the future, even with passing data of the future, who certain persons of interest are going to be? You know, that this vice chancellor at Stanford, Condoleezza Rice, is going to become Secretary of State, knowing that 10, 15, 20 years before it happens. How can we have any semblance of representative government in the United States if the mere fact that our governmental insiders are relying on forward intelligence is kept back from the American people? It's wrong. It has to change. Among the top US intelligence officials that I met when I was a child serving on Project Pegasus was John Alexander McComb, that other lieutenant of Stephen Bechtel during the war, who joined the Office of Strategic Services during the war, became one of the first most distinguished CIA agents, and ultimately reached the position of Director of Central Intelligence from 1960 to 64, which encompassed the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. John McCone was an exceptionally intelligent human being. I remember him sitting at a table in one of the restaurants in Old Town Albuquerque, and he was trying to explain to my father and a few other project engineers what this thing in the future called the internet was. And it was such a strange device that I remember the discussion. He said, well, you sit at this rudimentary electronic keyboard, like the ones that are now emerging on some of our electric typewriters, and you sit in front of a CRT, or he said VDT, video display terminal, not unlike a modern television set. And through that system, you can communicate with anybody, anywhere else in the world who's on the communication network. This gentleman is this is almost a direct quote, this gentleman is going to be the reduction to practice of Vannevar Bush's primary fundamental. Vannevar Bush, who was an early Defense Department Imagineer, had actually conceived of the idea of the internet as a defense technology. It would allow anybody in the world who was hooked into the system to communicate over wires or ultimately wireless. So hence the origin of the internet at DARPA. So John McCone, who I remember all the project engineers, including my father, were calling Alex. His middle name, I found, was Alexander. They were telling Alex, oh, I just don't get it. I really can't get my mind around this thing called the internet. Just some kind of weird, spooky technology, huh? Okay. So my dad gets up from the table. He was sitting across from John McCone and said, yeah, I'm still disturbed about this .com thing. And John McCone said, what do you mean, Ray? It's just an address. It's a postal address on the communications network. And my dad turned to him with all the certainty in the world and said, how do we know that? Maybe it means the commies have taken over by then. So that's really one of my favorite anecdotes from those years, because it shows that these Defense Department administrators and physicists and engineers like my dad, they by no means had total grasp of the future. They only knew about the future what entered their work with the time travel technologies I'm going to be describing for you, and whatever they read in the intelligence reports or that they heard in shop talk. So that was the first time I ever heard of the internet, and that was about 1971 in Albuquerque. There's no question, now this comes up a lot, and I think it's a fundamental question. In fact, I'm humbled by the focus on Nikola Tesla, because now that my Truth campaign has gone international, individuals from the most obscure cities anywhere in the world are always asking me about the debt that the US time-space program owed Nikola Tesla. It's almost like the collective memory of humanity will not surrender the debt of gratitude owed to Tesla. Tesla is sort of like the Jesus Christ or the Christopher Columbus, ultimately, of time travel. And people from the most obscure villages around the world that have internet access are constantly asking me about Tesla. In fact, according to my father, Robert Beckwith, who was a consulting engineer from General Electric, and Jack Pruitt, who was one of the team leaders of Project Pegasus, who would go on to become the research director of Project Montauk, according to Nichols and Moon, stated emphatically to me multiple times when I was a child on the project that not just did they owe a debt of gratitude to Tesla, but most of what they were doing on the project resulted from the works of Nikola Tesla that the War Department seized when they grabbed those lab manuals upon his death in January of 1943 and spirited them away to Los Alamos, because that's where the world's leading nuclear physicists were then gathering to build the atomic bomb under Project Manhattan. I was literally sitting across from eating my lunch at a Mexican restaurant in Albuquerque, Old Town Albuquerque, in probably about the fall of 1970, maybe into 1971. It's always hard to date specifically these memories. I've tried to arrange them in some semblance of order. But my late father, Ray, was sitting across from me, and he asked me whether I knew who Tesla was. And I said, yes, Dad. He was in one of the learning components in the learning lab. You know, we were doing this photo reading with this curriculum called Galileo that covered everything in science and society from the time of the High Renaissance, the time of Galileo, which was 1450 AD. And they were cramming that into the back of our unconscious with this photo reading technology, so that when we were time traveling, we would know everything from Aristarchus of Samos to Zbigniew Brzezinski. And although Zbig wasn't yet in the canon of Western civilization, fortunately, at that point. And I said, yeah, Dad, there was a component in Galileo about Tesla. My dad said, he was Czechoslovakian, wasn't he, Andrew? And I said, I think he was Serbian, Dad. He spoke Serbo-Croatian. He goes, oh, that's right. Well, anyway, son, he actually stuck his finger up in the air in the same way that Bob Beckwith would when he was talking about Tesla. He said, son, most of what we're doing in the project results from the works of Nikola Tesla. So here is the John von Neumann of time travel. It was Tesla, not von Neumann, not von Braun. Certainly Enrico Fermi played a larger role that has been emphasized. But Tesla really was the progenitor of time travel. He was working on physical teleportation, and by physical or vortal teleportation, I don't mean the quantum teleportation that's appearing in today's science news stories where they talk about what was going on in Star Trek, where you disintegrate something and reintegrate it at its point of at its destination. Tesla teleportation involves opening time-space up so you pass through it uninjured, or at least usually uninjured. Tesla's experiments at Colorado Springs and later on teleportation, my father and Raymond Kubik of Parsons once told me in around 1971, were repeated by my father at the Thomas A. Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey during the 1956 to 64 timeframe when he was employed there and the labs were there. These weren't the historical labs resulting from Edison in West Orange. This was a think tank begun in 1950, and they were inviting different distinguished physicists and engineers to work there. For example, J.B. Johnson, the discoverer of white noise, signal to ground noise, so-called Johnson noise, had a desk, 2 desks over from my father at the Edison labs. Forrest C. Nix, the famous solid-state physicist from the University of Pittsburgh, was also in his immediate environs there at the Edison labs. So my father once explained to me how he was doing things like magnetizing cylindrical coils and doing things like dropping a penny through it. And finding to his amazement that sometimes the penny was coming out of the cylinder too fast, too slow, or not at all. After I appeared on Coast to Coast AM in November of '09, I received an email from somebody who said, you know, it was interesting you talking about your dad working at the Edison labs, putting pennies through teleports, because when I was growing up in New Jersey, right around where you were growing up and doing these time travel things, in 1956, I found a 1958 penny. So I think as a result of appearing on national radio, I actually found not a witness, but an experiencer who maybe found one of the 1958 pennies that my dad dropped at some time after it was minted in 1958 or in 1958, so that somebody found it in the street in 1956. True story, and the person was entirely sincere. And for the devotees of conspiracy theory who just said, wow, those are the Black Friars. So the whole Vatican Bank scandal involving Roberto Calvi and Blackfriars Bridge in London, where Calvi was found hanged, was within the murky culture of the Benedictines. They, in fact, were my Sunday school teachers at Notre Dame of Mount Carmel Catholic Church, where I was being raised as a Catholic school kid. Well, I was going to Sunday school. I was enrolled in a public elementary school. But I took First Communion at a local Benedictine parish. And all of the children who were in my immediate group at Mount View Road Elementary were Catholic kids, primarily of Italian and German ancestry, probably because Hitler and Himmler had been studying the occult going back to the founding, or their joining of the Thule Society in 1919. And those Nazi occult bureau records entered the CIA when the CIA invited Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi intelligence chief from East Bavaria, into the OSS and then the CIA. So basically we're dealing with, in the derivation of time travel, we're dealing with the Catholic Church, the US, particularly the Benedictines, the CIA, the Navy, the CIA, and DARPA. But there was a Catholic fingerprint on the project, not just because we children were getting our religious education at a Benedictine parish and Sunday school, but because Ernetti was of the Order of St. Benedict. Working with Father Pierre Maria Gemelli, also a Benedictine, whose name is sometimes cited, for example, in Wikipedia as Augustino Gemelli, which was probably his civilian name, and also later with the distinguished Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, Ernetti and Gemelli and Fermi had developed two-dimensional chronovision by 1952, namely a flat-screen device like a TV, in which Ernetti claimed till his death in 1994, they had captured and you could see images of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. In 1972, at the Sandia National Labs in New Mexico, I saw about a 20-minute black and white documentary film, a 16-millimeter film, of a hologram in which the crucifixion of Jesus was captured. And I don't believe that it was a dramatization, and I do believe that it followed the account in the New Testament so closely that it's my position that I believe that Jesus was an historical figure and not some kind of concretion of previous mythological substrates. But in any case, Ernetti and Gemelli were extremely respected Catholic prelates. In fact, the largest Catholic hospital in Rome, the second largest hospital in Rome, the one that Pope John Paul II indeed died at after convalescing there for a number of months, was Gemelli Hospital. And Ernetti was never morally compromised prior to his death in 1994, nor did he ever refute his claim that they had captured images of the crucifixion. Imagine the import of that to Christian adherents, or how do you handle a discovery like that in a nation like America, where under the First Amendment freedom of religion clause, you have both the establishment clause, that government should not establish a religion, and the free exercise clause, that the government should not abridge the free exercise of religion. What do you do with a state research finding showing Jesus' crucifixion? And according to my father, and I say this not to proselytize, but my father even claimed that they had images of the resurrection of Jesus 3 days later. I wasn't shown that, so I only know what I was shown, but I did see the crucifixion. So I don't think we can really fault the government officials, even maybe the think tanks that were probably feeding into this decision of what to do with this information, because how do you release such information to a country like ours that is religiously tolerant, in which religious toleration by the government and by individuals is literally enshrined in our national charter. And the government itself is holding images of the crucifixion of a major religious figure. They were stuck. What I'm trying to do, as long as I have a voice to speak, is unstick the logjam of government inaction that resulted when our government developed chronovision and was able to capture scenes of past events as auspicious as the assassination of the avatar or your personal savior, if that's your belief, of Jesus of Nazareth. Because I saw the images, and I'm telling you, being raised in Catholicism, going to Sunday school, it was right out of the New Testament. You know, the women coming in praying, the Roman centurion grabbing the end of his spear and reaching up to shove Jesus in the side, you know, the spear of Longinus. The crown of thorns, which was huge, and blood, rivulets of blood were streaming down Jesus' face. He was bearded, his mouth was agape, he was in intense suffering. And so much of what was on the screen fit what I had been inculcated with as a Catholic Sunday school kid. So anyway, I just cite that example because it was very sensitive information. How do you reveal that you have time travel if it means showing stuff like the crucifixion of Jesus? It's going to be a game changer, definitely culturally, if you do. In any case, chronovision, according to Ernetti, this distinguished Catholic priest, was fully operational, at least in the flat screen version, by 1952. Another major figure who was the federal science administrator for DARPA's Project Pegasus was Dr. Harold M. Agnew, educated at the University of Chicago under Enrico Fermi. Agnew was the only human being present. Well, he's not only one of the Manhattan Project physicists, he was the only Manhattan Project physicist personally present at all three critical stages of the Manhattan Project. As the prized physics pupil of Enrico Fermi at Chicago, he was literally participating in the experiment involving nuclear fission when the atomic pile went critical in the squash courts at Chicago. You may remember they were manipulating bars of graphite to keep the uranium stable and then removing to see if they would go critical. Well, Agnew was one of the graduate students manipulating the graphite levers to control the CP1, the critical pile 1 at Chicago. He was also present at Los Alamos and Alamogordo when the atomic bomb was built and tested at Trinity site. And he followed the plane that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the Enola Gay, in a chase plane called the Great Artiste to calibrate the magnitude of the blast. So Agnew wasn't just one of the Manhattan Project physicists. He was the main guy. He was the one who was present in all three critical stages. I met Harold Agnew sometime between my 6th and 7th birthday, sometime between September of 1967 and 68, and this is how it happened. I was playing at our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey on a Saturday morning, and actually that wouldn't have been a Saturday because we met Agnew, but sometimes my dad would take me up to Curtis Wright on weekends, particularly Saturday. But anyway, it was sometime between September of 67 and 68. Is that mine? I hope it's not Harold Agnew. Keep tabs on him. He's now about 90 and living in a suburb of San Diego. He was born in 1920, so he's going to be 91 this year. Very nice man. All of the individuals I worked with in Project Pegasus were just fine Americans. They were trying to achieve survival and peace in the nuclear age by achieving time travel. So my dad said to my mother, "Hun, I'm taking Andy to the hardware store." There was a local hardware store in Florham Park, New Jersey, as Joan may remember, that big hardware store out in Florham Park. You smelled the grass seed there when you entered the open garden area there. And we'll be back in a couple hours. Well, he didn't take me to Florham Park or the hardware store. He took me to the old Curtis Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Wood Ridge, New Jersey. Curtis Wright was the principal plane manufacturing R&D center during World War II. There was an air museum there with 8 or 10 absolutely exquisite vintage airplanes built by Glenn Curtiss primarily, who later founded Curtis Wright with one of the Wright brothers. And we went through a security desk into the engineering building, through the engineering building into Building 68. All of these large brick R&D buildings at Curtis Wright had numbers. The building that we entered was building 68. And there in a room about twice the size of a high school chemistry lab were two gray, that is to say battleship gray booms that were elliptical objects freely standing on their base, which was the Tesla teleport unit that we were there to jump through. Now, I apologize for not having schematics or renderings. I'm still working on getting these time travel devices actually drawn by a draftsman. These two elliptical objects were about 8 feet high and about 10 feet apart on the ground. And my dad had the technician sitting at a keyboard controlling the left boom. The right boom was plugged into the wall. He said, yes, you can turn it on. And the technician turned it on. By the way, my dad wasn't pulling rank on people, but he was actually, well, he had been a private first class during World War II as a combat medic and ambulance driver in France and Germany when Laura's great-grandfather was leading the Allied war effort as Supreme Allied Commander. He had just been a private during the war, but in the defense technical community, my dad was what was called a major in the 2nd Reserve. We actually had a cadre of shadow political and military leaders who had standing orders to report to a certain location in the event, for example, of a Soviet takeover of the lower 48. So my dad was a major in the Army. In fact, he was a major with false credentials. The name on his credentials was Henry Przybski, who was a Polish-American neighbor and friend of his from his hometown of Summit Hill, New Jersey, who was killed during the war. So one time when we were getting into, not to Curtis Wright, but into Camp Kilmer, an Army base in New Brunswick, New Jersey, I said, Dad, you're not a major. I thought you were a private. And then he explained about the 2nd Reserve, and I said, and who's Henry Przybski? And he said, oh, that was a good friend of mine from Summit Hill who died during the war. So I'm looking for the Henry Przybski files under the U.S. Army Defense Technical System. So anyway, my dad had the technician turn the device on, and it basically broadcast a shimmering curtain of bluish-white radiant energy. From about 10 feet away, it looked sort of like water gently falling in a public sculpture like you find in Austin, Texas, where you have these beautiful public fountains where the water is detained for a while and shimmers in the sunlight. But when my dad had us walk up to about a foot away from the shimmering curtain of radiant energy being a form of energy that Nikola Tesla discovered that is latent and pervasive throughout the entire physical universe, and that has among its capabilities the capacity to bend the fabric of time-space. Up close, what I saw was a snow pattern, like raster on a black and white TV set, and then across the raster from these little green-blue ports along the interior of the armatures of the device, the booms, I saw these little squiggles of blue light going in opposite directions at 3-inch intervals across the field of radiant energy. So this was an electromagnetic device that when we jumped through that curtain of radiant energy was going to open up time-space in the same way that a child opens up a cylinder of air when they blow a bubble. It was pushing time-space around us and moving it past us, or alternatively, we were moving through it. So my dad said, son, what's going to happen is I'm going to hold your hand on the count of 3. We're going to jump through this curtain of energy, and we're going to go through kind of like a tunnel. You don't have to do anything, but after a few seconds, we're going to find ourselves on a hillside somewhere else in the country. So we did a couple of dry runs, and then on the count of 3, holding my father's hand, in a way that you might have seen depicted in the TV show Fringe after they stole a lot of my story elements for their early broadcasts, where Walter Bishop, not Raymond Bishago, holds his son Peter's hand, not his brother Andrew's hand. Okay. Anyway, some of my stuff's been ripped off by Fringe, but that's fine. It has to enter the collective unconscious at some point. But so my dad said, just hold my hand. The count of 3 will jump through the curtain of energy. Well, we did so. He also said the tunnel may compartmentalize into different rooms or portions. So if we get lost, just stay where you find yourself elsewhere in the country. So holding my dad's hand, we jumped through the curtain of radiant energy, and I found myself in a vortal tunnel in time-space, which I would, during about maybe 40 round trips between New Jersey and New Mexico over the next 4 to 5 years until 72. The vortal tunnel was about 20 feet in diameter. It looked like white, bluish, bluish-white energy that was moving at a great rate of speed. But when I turned my head to the left and right, I could actually see my dad's hair moving around electrostatically. And he later laughed as he described how terrified I looked. But I was pretty much overwhelmed because they were bringing the universe past us at a great rate of speed. So when I looked to my left or right, I could see all these holographic images of events occurring in a kind of like a random chaos of jumble of events. We were slicing through alternate timelines, but to a known destination. And when we arrived, I later found we were in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a distance of 2,005 miles. Oddly, the year of publication of Exopolitics, 2005, there's a synchronicity I didn't even think about. Right. 2,005 miles from Woodridge, New Jersey to Santa Fe, New Mexico. They were using the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds as the collection area for the teleportees jumping, quantum leaping, if you will, into New Mexico from different time labs like this around the country. Different rooms they called teleports, where the teleporter was, and the armatures of the teleporter was tuning radiant energy in so we could jump through it. They were doing that because obviously the state capitol complex is a place where kids are going to get lost. So if you see a kid, or even an adult for that matter, suddenly popping into view and running around the building, you're going to think, oh, there's some kid on a field trip, don't have to worry about that child. They were also, as I mentioned, they were using Santa Fe because Santa Fe had been the territorial capital of what became the state of New Mexico 400 years before Project Pegasus began teleporting people there. Also, I later found from my father that they didn't want us, even when we were going to the Los Alamos National Labs, they didn't want people teleporting anywhere into Los Alamos, the laboratory, or the town, because as my dad said, somebody at the labs might see something. And we now know that the Klaus Fuchs spy ring had infiltrated the Los Alamos National Labs on behalf of the KGB. And so think of the Cold War irony of this. Here, the Los Alamos National Labs had been central in developing teleportation-based time travel. But even when they were still experimenting with it, they were teleporting into New Mexico, into Santa Fe, rather than Los Alamos, to conceal it from the nth person in the labs who might be a Soviet spy or collaborator of some kind. So my dad literally explained it, that we can't, because one time we actually, a number of times, but one time in particular, he was given some military plans at Curtis Wright, and we teleported to Santa Fe. I said, why don't we just teleport to Los Alamos? And he said, we can't. And he said, we can't. And I said, why not? And he said, because somebody at the labs may see something. Okay, so I interpret that to mean, Soviet personnel at the labs. Because as my father said, my dad was a Polish American, clearly an anti-communist, because of course Poland had been invaded and essentially placed under Soviet domination. He also explained to me that the thrust of the project was, as he put it in his provincial eastern Pennsylvania way, to stay 2 steps ahead of the Ruskies. So clearly that was a major emphasis, was staying ahead on the time travel front from the Soviet communists. From Santa Fe, we took a car and drove up to the Los Alamos National Labs. In those years, 1967, 68, Harold Agnew was, you go in the main floor and over on the right, he was the director of the weapons division, the W division of the labs. And we got to his office before he did. And he came in, and my dad handed him the prospectus that he was there to deliver, which was the prospectus to involve civilians, including adults and children, ultimately to include myself, in the time-space exploration, research, and development activities that were then underway. And, I can remember that era, how confident and friendly everybody was. He said, so Ray, how was your trip? My dad looked up and said, oh, fine, and fast. And Harold looked up sheepishly from the prospectus and said, oh, did you take the teleporter? And my dad, being a proponent of the notion that teleportation should be used for civilian transport, obviously including children, looked over at me and said, yes, and so did my young son, Andrew. And then Harold looked over at me and saw one of the kids that Project Talent sourced who would be cute enough to have direct contact with extraterrestrials, and looked up at me and said, how old? And my father and I said simultaneously 6, meaning that that meeting had to occur between September of 1967 and 68. May have been the first time, maybe the second time that I teleported with Dad, but it was at least the time that we could first date. And my dad said, kind of goading Harold, said, "Have you tried it yet?" And Harold said, "No, but I want to." And I think that creates the rebuttable presumption that teleportation was then a new toy inside the defense community. Because if it had been around any longer, certainly Harold Agnew, who was then the director of the weapons division, he was the head of the nuclear bomb makers. In 1970, he would become the director of the Los Alamos National Labs, directing a multi-billion-dollar annual budget. Clearly, if it had been around much longer than a few months or years, he would have already tried it. But he said, "No, but I want to try it. I want to teleport and see what it's like." So I think that that's an important historical anecdote because it demonstrates that teleportation was a new technical proficiency around the time that I first teleported with my dear old dad between 1967 and 68. That's why I date my involvement in Project Pegasus from 1968, even though officially I would enter it in an administrative and practical context in 1969. I called Harold Agnew in 2000. He was then 80, and he engaged in what we call a tacit admission in the law. When I said, I'm recovering these memories of teleporting on a federal defense project that you were on. I think you may have been the director. And he said, "No, you're mixed up. The teleportation project wasn't at LANL. Keep checking. It was at one of the other major labs in New Mexico." Well, that's an admission that the program existed. He was right. It was officially at Sandia. And I've corroborated that because when my father and I met the late great physicist, not Enrico Fermi, I'm blanking on his name. We met one of the other Manhattan Project physicists in the hallway there at LANL, and my dad informed this individual that Emilio Segre, it's a difficult name, Emilio Segre, C-E-G-R-E, or R-E-U. We met Emilio Segre in the hall at LANL, and my dad explained that we were there in New Mexico on a teleportation project based at Sandia. So Sandia, the so-called junk science producer for the US Defense Department, in fact was the primary lab where Project Pegasus was sited. Agnew was pretty much just consulting the project as an administrator. I remember there was a discussion, for example, of the budget that my father would be spending in expensing the business expenses of the project personnel who were coming into New Mexico to work on the project. And there was a discussion of a paper trail. He urged my father basically not to keep any financial records or records per se. Records were being kept, however, of the teleportees, our entry into New Mexico and our exit from New Mexico via teleportation. And they were being kept behind the counter at the La Hacienda restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque, where Connie worked. So my dad's personal network in New Mexico was kind of loaned to the CIA, and in a sense, kind of part of it. Okay. So Agnew, major figure, acknowledged the existence of the project when I contacted him in 2000, and then in all subsequent interviews, all the way to his 2009 discussion with the science journalist Ralph Steiner, denied everything and said that I was telling a tall story. Well, back when he was initially senile in 2000 at age 80, Harold, bless his heart, was telling the truth. We had extensive contact with Harold on the project. Every time we used to pass each other, he used to stick me in the belly button with his finger. I didn't forget that very easily as a 6-year-old initially. I also remember that he would tousle my hair and that he was known for being so cheap that he wouldn't even pick up his own lunch tab at lunch. And there had been some joking about that at the end of one of the lunches in Albuquerque, and it was I who said, "Yeah, you're like Jack Benny, you're so cheap." And one of the other project engineers said, "Yeah, Harold, you're the Jack Benny of the atomic research community." So Harold Agnew was not a stranger. He was my father's friend and our colleague, and he was telling the truth, bless his heart, when I first contacted him. Clearly at age 85 and 90, perhaps he was just forgetting or being defensive about what he had worked on, which included primarily bomb making, but also time travel. I mentioned Dr. Enrico Fermi working with Ernetti and Gemelli. Well, he had also been Harold's mentor at the University of Chicago. So Fermi influenced Agnew in the area of teleportation, which Agnew was directing when Project Pegasus was fully fledged. And in the 40s and 50s, he had that background working in chronovision with Ernetti and Gemelli. So this would be the hidden figure in time travel that speculatively has been attributed to Einstein, John von Neumann, and others. So clearly, I believe that an intense investigation of Fermi's files may yield evidence of his knowledge of the advent of time travel. Another individual we worked with extensively, this is a much later picture of him. When we worked with him, he was a 39-year-old former congressman from suburban Chicago and former Navy fighter pilot from Chicago named Donald Henry Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld secretly served as the defense attaché to Project Pegasus, unofficially and secretly, when he was officially serving on President Nixon's board of wage and price stabilization. How many meetings do you need to stabilize wages and prices? Right? After the accountants come up with a chart, you sit around and drink coffee and tea and chit-chat. I mean, so Rumsfeld clearly was often leaving those meetings because I had many contacts with him as a child on Project Pegasus, all of them taking place, by the way, in New Mexico. Not a large man, about 5'9", very 125% in the room, so to speak. Don Rumsfeld had a very voluble personality. He was known as kind of a super patriot. I remember one cocktail party at one of the big hotels in downtown Albuquerque where he was regaling a number of the project engineers, including my dad, about how as a fighter pilot in World War II, he would line up enemy combatants on the ground and just go bam, 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 and shoot them down. I also remember that long before Jack Palance did a one-arm push-up on the Academy Award broadcast, Rumsfeld would often entertain his colleagues by doing a one-arm push-up. So if he insisted I didn't work with him, I'm going to remind him of how proficient he was at one-arm push-ups. He was essentially the point man between the Defense Department and project personnel in the evolving time-space program. He was essentially the man from the DoD. He was the keeper of the secrets. Well, I don't think it's coincidental or accidental that shortly thereafter, in fact a year after I left Project Pegasus, Donald Rumsfeld became, for the first time, Secretary of Defense under President Gerald R. Ford, and then many years later, Secretary of Defense under President George W. Bush. In fact, he was the second death during 9/11 when the World Trade Centers were knocked down and the Pentagon attacked, and that plane came down in Pennsylvania. And that's disconcerting because, as I'll describe later, Project Pegasus had retrieved moving film-like images of the World Trade Center event, that component of 9/11, in the early 1970s, in a project that Rumsfeld served as the defense attaché for. In addition, my testimony establishes that 9/11 was openly discussed of in the project circles because it was this future domestic Pearl Harbor of a very serious nature. At least that was the conventional explanation, that it was the first major attack against the United States on our soil since the Revolutionary War from outside the United States. Now, I want to put this in historical context. Rumsfeld's the defense attaché. We had the footage. I saw the footage myself, my father, in the company of my father one day, and the project had that information. Did that mean that he was conscious of that event on that 9/11, or that they let it happen because they knew it was going to happen? Well, possibly, but the bottom line is we can really apply Rumsfeld's old standard of epistemology here. You know, we know what we know what we don't know, but we don't know what we don't know. So in fact, we don't know what Rumsfeld knew on September 11th of 2001, but I know what he connected to, which was the defense technical project that retrieved moving images from the future of 9/11, 30 years before it happened. And I'd like to thank Alfred for all the courageous journalism you've done, not just supporting my account of Project Pegasus, but specifically this complicating factor that ties Rumsfeld to Project Pegasus and Project Pegasus to prior knowledge of the events of 9/11. It has to be paid attention to. It has to be addressed by the 9/11 research community because it's fraught with potential implications. I was present, I had major contact with Rumsfeld in spring of 1971 when I was invited to a talk that he gave, as he described it, a meet and greet, that was held in an underground briefing room, a kind of an amphitheater, at the Cerrillos Cultural Center in Cerrillos, New Mexico. If you travel to Cerrillos and Madrid, out south, do you know that area? You used to live there? Southeast of Santa Fe, right? You go out and then down to Cerrillos. On Highway 14, which is Cerrillos Road that comes down from the state capitol grounds and then goes out southeast, you can make that right into the town of Cerrillos, like to the post office, or you can go around the bend to Madrid, and then you have like the Mine Shaft Tavern is right there. Right as you make that left turn, after avoiding that sharp right turn to go to the town of Cerrillos, there's a retaining wall with a jumble of adobe buildings. That's the Cerrillos Cultural Center, and it was built by the WPA during the Great Depression. And it was there that they had the Stargate that we used to jump to 2045, and it's there that they had the chronovisor in New Mexico that they were using to send me to the Lincoln assassination site. And it was there that I attended this briefing in spring of '71 that Secretary Rumsfeld gave. I have a verbatim account of what he said. It's going to be in my book. It's word for word. I've done the memory work. You may recall the anecdote that when I was counting back in the learning lab, the teacher would give me a number and I'd tell her what the number was, and then she'd give me the second number and I'd tell her what the two numbers were. Well, we did that to 84 places. So did I have the memory to remember what Don Rumsfeld said in a special briefing in 1971? I have everything. And the significant point that he made is, and this is a direct quote, "We believe that the significance of teleportation is primarily military. It will allow us to put troops precisely where they're needed on the battlefield." And he held up his fingers like that. "It'll allow us to put the troops precisely where they're needed on the battlefield." And I always thought that Don Rumsfeld sounded like Henry Fonda to some extent. Or Tennessee Tuxedo, but that's Al Gore. I'm sorry, and he was basically saying that because they had done studies during World War II, establishing that the majority of our casualties did not occur in the front lines, nor in the rear areas, but as we were moving troops up to the front lines, and they were falling in the water and drowning, they were being shot from behind by friendly fire and artillery and shells and stuff. They were being picked off by snipers, not realizing they were up to the front line yet, but they were still vulnerable. That the great thing about Tesla's teleportation is it would allow us to put troops precisely where they were needed. So if suddenly there was an Arab-Israeli cataclysm of some kind at the Dome of the Rock, we would storm the Dome of the Rock with 2,000 paratroopers from Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. This was literally what they were thinking was the best thing that we could achieve with teleportation. So here we have Nikola Tesla's teleportation being captured by the War Department at the time of his death. And here in 1971, now 28 years later, we have one of the cardinals of the American Kremlin, Donald Rumsfeld, one of the career defense apparatchiks in our nation's history. In fact, I think in elapsed time, Donald Rumsfeld has spent more time as defense secretary than any other person, believing that we should keep teleportation secret as a military application and hold it back from the civilian economy. I think that that was a disastrous decision. I mean, I know why they did it. They were trying to save the lives of troops during active combat. The problem is none of us have been teleporting ever since. We've been flying from London to Sydney and staying on the plane for 24 hours until we get blood clots and birth defects among our pregnant women and miscarriages and pulmonary thrombosis and that huge fatigue you get when you're flying. We could have been moving between London and Sydney and every other major world city since 1970 in seconds. We could have alleviated all that burden of air pollutants and particulates in the global atmosphere. What I find so disturbing when I started to piece together where my participation in this project kind of fit in the historical flow is that when I was sitting in a seminar as a kid on Project Pegasus, suggesting that one of the benefits of teleportation would be that it would help alleviate the greenhouse effect, Al Gore was sitting in Roger Revelle's class as an undergraduate at Harvard, being inspired for the first time to care about global warming. I mean, the technology was already available at the time that some of our most idealistic minds began worrying about climate change. So beyond just discussing climate change, we have to advance solutions in the 21st century. or our goose is cooked primarily as a result of the threat that Project Pegasus and the CIA in general had identified in the early 70s, which is if we get enough global melting from global warming, if global warming goes critical, for example, as a result of all those greenhouse gases continuing to build up in the atmosphere from fuel-intensive, energy-intensive forms of transport by plane, train, and automobile, we will basically have a quelling of the Gulf Stream, the heat exchange between the warm equatorial waters and the northern Arctic waters will fail. And then when that happens, there'll be enough dilution to prevent the salt in the oceans from exchanging hot temperatures from the equator to the north, and we will have a massive ice age, as described by Art Bell and Whitley Strieber in their book, The Coming Global Superstorm, which was made into a film entitled, I think, was it The Day After Tomorrow? Was that the climate change one? Okay. So the CIA was already worried about this in the early 70s. When I performed my investigation over the last 10 years, I found out that it still is. Basically, the Andrew Marshall contingency plan drafted for the Pentagon, that we have to worry about coastal flooding and ultimately potentially ice age conditions from global warming, was stated to me by Ernest Garcia, the Army Security Attaché to Project Pegasus, when I interviewed him around 2004, is still the #1 national security threat to the continental United States. Well, why then is the Defense Department, the agency that was responsible for securing our well-being, not engaging in a program of disclosing and spreading teleportation via technology transfer to every city on the planet? Because when we do that, we can completely scrap our planes, our trains, and our automobiles. Imagine the insanity of flying between distant world cities via plane when we could have been doing it in jump rooms 40 years ago. Imagine driving from your home to your local grocery store with 4,000 pounds of metal strapped around your waist. I mean, we claim to be an intelligent species, but we're not acting very intelligently. But we can act intelligently by pressuring our government to declassify and deploy teleportation, and that's a major thrust of my Truth campaign. Has Rumsfeld stood in my way? No, but like Governor Richardson, he certainly hasn't stepped forward. He hasn't evinced the highest standard of public service by saying, look, I did a lot of interesting things during my career working for the Department of Defense, and one of them was helping it achieve time travel. Let's take some of these time travel technologies and use them to advantage everybody on the planet. I mean, Don Rumsfeld would win the Nobel Peace Prize if he made that announcement with Bill Richardson and myself in Santa Fe one day. And that's what I've asked of Bill Richardson through intermediaries, and he still has not responded. So we have a problem here, and that is our current elected and appointed leadership is asleep at the switch, and we may have a mass disaster if they don't allow humanity to live and work under the most advanced technologies that human genius, the genius of somebody like Nikola Tesla, gave us 100 years ago, 110 years ago. Oh, here's Bill Richardson. He was the individual right after he completed his course of studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Boston, taking role when we first began teleporting to Santa Fe in the summer of 1970. Like a number of these project insiders, he went on to an illustrious career, presumably or putatively in elected office, although I believe that he's been basically with CIA during his entire career. As the congressman from the 3rd District, where all of the atomic labs in New Mexico are located, Lanell and Sandia for starters, as energy secretary under President Clinton, as UN representative, and as ultimately governor of New Mexico. So Bill Richardson, who began in time travel as a recent college grad at age 24, 25, I think Bill was born in 45, so he's about 25 in the summer of 70 when I first met him, and he took role when we began teleporting in earnest as a group of children in summer of 70. He would take us inside one of the buildings there in Santa Fe, I think it's the building that now houses the Attorney General of New Mexico, sit us in a chair and ask us our first name, our last name, have us spell our last name, and provide our birth date, month, day, and year. So I said, Andrew, and they said, Andrew what? And I said, Andrew Bashago. I said, how do you spell that, Andy? And I said, B-A-S-I-A-G-O. And he said, well, that's kind of unusual. Wouldn't that be pronounced Basiago? And I said, no, it's Polish, it's slurred, it's Bashago. And he said, your birth date, Andrew? And I said, 9/18/61. And he was just about ready to dismiss me. He'd written it all down, he'd taken roll, and I was accounted for. I hadn't been lost in time, teleporting there to Santa Fe. And I looked up at him, and again, in one of my Huck Finn moments that I'm proud of, I said, "What's your name?" And he looked up at me as this 25-year-old who was destined to become governor of the state that we were sitting in, and he said, "Bill," and then looked down again, sort of scribbling. And I leaned forward like I was in front of the Senate, Armed Services Committee. I said, "Bill what?" And he said, "Richardson, Bill Richardson." "Oh, and what's your birthday?" He said, "Blah, blah, blah, 1945, if you have to know. But I think I'm done with you, Andrew. Thank you very much." Right?